So I'll be talking about what's going on in the United States. I'll be looking at, there's different things that I have in mind. I want to give you a little bit more detailed sense of what's going on. I want to look a little bit more carefully about why it's going on, also some of the history to how we have gotten to this point. And also think about a little bit, and maybe we can also in our discussions do it a little bit more, think about some of the, not just the overlaps in terms of how the United States and the Netherlands thinks about academic freedom, but also there's a couple key differences. Where I want to start, let me take you to New York. It's Friday morning, 7th of March, 2025. On the campus of Columbia University, one of the oldest and proudest universities in the United States, the first emails start to arrive just after 8:30. Funding suspension immediate. Within hours, the news is everywhere. The Trump administration has frozen $400 million in federal research grants and contracts to Columbia. The official reason that the university has, in the government's words, quote, failed to protect Jewish students from a hostile environment. For months, the campus had been a stage for fierce protest about the genocide in Gaza. There had been encampments, arrests, and an occupation of Hamilton Hall, redubbed Heinz Hall, in the spring of 2024, renamed by the demonstrators. Now, almost a year later, the Trump administration has struck. The freeze comes not through Congress and not through the law courts, but by executive order and agency directive. First from the White House on January 29th, then from the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights and the Department of Health and Human Services. The agencies accuse Columbia of violating the Title VI and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which forbids discrimination on grounds of race or religion. The irony is sharp and painful. So Columbia University has fundamentally failed to protect American students and faculty from anti-Semitic violence and harassment, in addition to other alleged violations of Title VI and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so I think that's one of the points that I really wanted to convey, because I'm not sure how clear that is to Dutch audiences, that one of the driving initiatives of the Trump administration in their responses to American universities and the demands that they're making of them are centered specifically on the experiences as they portray them of Jewish students. Okay. So one of the things that's very important here is that they're saying that the universities are violating the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And this is ironic and painful because the Civil Rights Act, this was the moment here, you can see it, you have President Lyndon Johnson, he's signing the Civil Rights Act. It was an idea of Kennedy's. Kennedy is assassinated, so Lyndon Johnson completes it. And this was the first time in the United States that at the federal level, discrimination was made illegal. It's one of the most important pieces of legislation of the 20th century in the United States, very strongly associated with the Democratic Party, very strongly associated also with issues of racial emancipation, racial equality, racial justice. So the fact that the Trump administration is using this legislation as a way of punishing universities is the first time that you've had a Republican president and politician and party make use of this legislation in this fashion. And in the process, what they're doing is that they're inverting it. And they're using it for quite other kinds of purposes, because in addition to asserting that Jewish students and Jewish faculty have been discriminated, they also use it in other instances as a way of making arguments that white students and faculty have been discriminated. So they're using civil rights legislation in the opposite way as it had always been used and intended. And this is the moment, by the way, where Johnson, after signing it, he used a ceremonial pen, and he gives it to Martin Luther King. It's coming in the midst of the civil rights movement, right, and in recognition of what that movement has been achieving and has meant. While the university negotiates with Trump, and the demands that were made by Trump are also very important to know, right? So the demands that you saw on that the email that had been sent to them was the protesters that had been active on campus, and in particular ones who had occupied the building, that they should be expelled or suspended. That's discipline. The whole disciplinary process of the university needs to be transformed, that any existing disciplinary panels, separate disciplinary committees, that they be abolished, and the university president should be the one who decides all cases, that there should be essentially no more protests, and that how that should be achieved is through having these very, very strict rules about where, when, and how demonstrations can occur. That there cannot be any kinds of masks that are worn, and that in fact any students that are demonstrating or faculty have to wear their identification on their clothing in a clearly visible fashion. At the same time, student groups, particular, needed to be banished, including Jewish groups. One of the groups that particularly was visible was Jewish Voice for Peace, the student chapter of that. Another very important aspect was to redefine anti-Semitism and to make use of a definition of anti-Semitism that includes anti-Zionism as a form of discrimination. To empower the campus police, so there's a distinction between, for example, your everyday police that you see out on the street, or that in New York you would see outside the campus, and campus security. And the demand of the Trump administration was that campus police themselves should be empowered to make arrests, for example. And that the government should take over the Middle East and African Studies departments, and that there be 5-year federal supervision of these departments. Last but not least, that the admissions policies be changed, that the government be given access to all data related to admissions, and that recruitment from now on would align with government priorities. Now, that legislation, while the university negotiates with the Trump administration, at the same time as it's making these demands and it's frozen these funds, right, research groups are losing access to their budgets, international scholars can't be paid, students with federal scholarships panic. The American Council on Education warns that this is a dangerous precedent. If a government can suspend hundreds of millions at will, no university is safe. And indeed, the Trump administration sets its sights on dozens of universities, right? So to start with, as you know, Columbia University, 400 million, the Harvard University, 2.28 billion in grants, plus 600 million or 60 million in contracts, frozen in April 2025. Later, this was blocked by a judge in September, and Harvard is still negotiating as we speak. Princeton University, somewhere between 200 and 210 million in multi-year research grants were halted also in April. Partial restoration and another separate block of climate research. Brown University, federal reimbursement grants frozen. NIH, that's the National Institute for Health. There was a deal that was made in July of this year that restored the funding, and Brown has agreed to devote 50 million over 10 years to various programs that the government wanted. And the University of Pennsylvania, 175 million in federal funding frozen, which later was restored after they reached an agreement. Cornell University, 250 million. So all of these universities, I'm not sure if they're all familiar to you, but these are all very, very renowned universities. If you look at other kinds of actions that the government took that are not quantified, that don't have to do with billions and millions. That starts with the executive order, EO, that you see at the top right, Executive Order 14188, that was entitled Additional Measures to Combat Anti-Semitism, and directed agencies to intensify enforcement at schools receiving federal funds. Then you get system-wide, this is Office of Civil Rights letters to higher ed educations, March 10th, 2025, and these were sent to roughly 60 colleges and universities across the country, warning them that they might be investigated, that they might be in violation. Multiple universities were probed for Title VI anti-Semitism violations. Dozens of campuses were investigated, including some that had already previous investigations that had been ended. Duke University, another renowned university, there was an Office of Civil Rights investigation announced by the Department of Education. Princeton University, dozens of research grants suspended across agencies. That's Department of Education, NASA, and Department of Defense, also April 2025. And the University of Virginia entered into an agreement with the administration in October in order to pause investigations. So very clearly the Trump administration was using these investigations of civil rights violations, that as they were calling them, in order to pressure the universities to come to agreements with them. An example, the one that was most in the news, right, in terms of the responses, Colombia's response. Colombia indicated very quickly that it would cooperate fully with federal authorities and ensure compliance with federal law. So this is different than, for example, Harvard. There have been some universities that have said, hell no, we'll see you in court. But there have been other universities that very, very quickly have sought to settle. So Columbia University was one of those. It agreed to use the IRA anti-Semitism definition. That's the anti-Semitism definition that over time has come to be associated with defining anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, defining criticisms of Israel as anti-Semitism. Mandatory training for faculty, staff, and students with the Defense League, Project Shema, Foundation to Combat Anti-Semitism, so different kinds of anti-Semitism training, and the appointment of a Title VI, Title VII coordinator. So lots and lots of initiatives related to combating anti-Semitism. In addition to that, over 120 students were disciplined for protests. That itself might not sound so shocking, but the punishments were extreme. Students were expelled, students were suspended for multiple years. Some of them had their degrees revoked, so they had completed all of their degree requirements. They were either they had already graduated or were on the verge of graduating, and then Columbia revoked their degrees from them. Protests clearly there was absolutely no room for protests. And then two student groups, Students for Justice in Palestine and Jewish Voice for Peace, were suspended. They were first suspended in November 10th, 2023, and their status as suspended organizations continues into 2025. And what that means is that they can't get funding, they can't make use of spaces. If they want to advertise, they probably have problems, putting up posters and advertising. So they are no longer recognized as a Columbia University student group. And what that means is, of course, is that there's a very clear distinction being drawn in the kinds of responses that you're getting from the administration and from the government to different Jewish communities, right? So very, very much a lot of initiative that are focused on protecting, safeguarding, promoting Jews who are pro-Israel, while in fact punishing and banishing Jews who have been very active in the pro-Palestinian and anti-genocide movement in New York. And you might know, right, New York City has the largest Jewish community outside of Israel. It is a very, very Jewish city. And the Jewish community within New York City itself is very divided on these issues. And it has been transforming over the course of the genocide in Gaza. And so it's very, very clear that sides are being taken and decisions are being made about which Jews should be protected. In Washington, right, this case and Columbia's willingness to bend the knee, right, is cheered as a model. In academia, it feels like a bomb has exploded. And yet, seen from Europe, this isn't only an American story, right? Dutch scholars with projects in the US begin receiving anxious emails from their supervisors. Are your grants still going to be valid? Our universities in the last year or two have started checking contracts for contingency clauses. What happens if an American partner loses funding because of politics? In other words, the shock traveled across the Atlantic faster than an academic can publish a paper about it. What began as a campus protest has become a test of principle. How far can a democracy go in disciplining its universities before it undermines the very freedom it claims to defend? And how far can a university go in disciplining its students and employees before it undermines the very truth it claims to defend? Because the confrontation feels so extreme, we might think it began with Trump himself. Yet the struggle over education and politics in America has a much longer history, one that helps us see how the current conflict became possible. The politicization of education, before I get into that, I just wanted to show you a bit of the impact, right? And in terms of why is this having such an impact? To give you a general overview, right? So $5 billion in federal university research funding has been frozen or suspended. This lists some of the universities, there's many more. 3,500 National Institute of Health, NIH, grants have been terminated or delayed. That means 70,000 jobs are at risk. 180 researchers were laid off at Columbia University. More than 2,000 positions were cut at Johns Hopkins. And that has to do with the government's cancellation of USAID. 223 energy projects worth about just over $7.5 billion have been canceled or deferred. Legal challenges from Harvard, UCLA, and others over due process violations are taking shape. And Federal Executive Order 14188 links research funding to institutional compliance. The estimate is that the annual loss in US economic output is going to be between 10 to 16 billion, according to the Center for American Progress. Now, if you look in specific fields, right, because it's impacting different ones differently, in the biomedical and health sciences, the NIH freezes of 3,500 grants, labs have been closed, 25,000 jobs have been affected. In energy engineering, energy tech, 7.6 billion in research and development cuts, hundreds of projects have been ended. Global health and public health, about 800 million USAID cut, 2,000 layoffs as Johns Hopkins. Basic science, National Science Foundation is NSF, slowest funding pace in 35 years, 15% drop in new grants. Research training pipelines, postdoc, PhD hires have been frozen, 70,000 jobs have been lost. And it's ironic, but when I was flying, I was in New York a few weeks ago, and then when I was flying back, I was sitting next to a man who originally was in India, who had gotten his PhD in bioengineering in the United States, I think at Stanford University, and he was now flying from New York to Lund University because he was hoping that he would get a job there. Because he said that the situation in the US was so devastating that in fact, that there were many people like himself looking for jobs in Europe. And he had a lot of competition for the job, and it turned out that the 3 other people that he was competing against in Lund were all Indians who had been trained in the United States, who were now trying to be getting jobs in Europe. Right, so the effect overall is talent drain, weakened innovation, politicization of science, and the erosion of trust. I'll come back to that. The politicization of education in the United States did not begin with Donald Trump. His government is only the most forceful expression of a struggle that has been building for many decades, a struggle over who gets to decide what counts as knowledge, whose values schools should teach, and what role the university should play in society. So let me take you back a little bit. It's 1951. A 25-year-old Yale graduate named William Buckley Jr. publishes a slim, elegant book called God and Man at Yale. In it, he accuses his professors of undermining Christianity and capitalism under the banner of academic freedom. The idea that the university might be a site of moral danger, too secular, too liberal, too cosmopolitan, takes root on the American right. And William Buckley Jr. would go on to be a very important national figure, important national conservative, very articulate, very, very smart, and a real pain in the butt for if you were progressive. So this was sort of his starting point. 3.5 decades later, in 1987, another book makes headlines. Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind. Bloom, a University of Chicago political philosopher, laments that students no longer read the great books and that moral relativism has taken over the classroom. As he speaks, universities are establishing African American, ethnic, and women's studies departments. The demographic composition of the students is changing, and with time, that of the professors too. The questions they find important to ask change, so does what they study and how they teach. Increasingly, American universities are becoming somewhat better reflections of their societies. And this is from the time when I was when I was in high school, and I remember this book coming out, and it caused a huge, huge, huge debate. And it was very much a book that was very, very unhappy with the direction that the universities were going, precisely because with the establishment of these new, not just these new departments in women's studies, African American studies, and so forth, but also just entire curriculums were starting to change because people were saying, let's look at a much more diverse set of readings, a much more diverse set of histories, of artists, of scientists, and so forth, of social scientists. And so the kind of university that he had been educated in was starting to disappear. And this frightens and infuriates some. They see this as a decline. Bloom's book sells more than 1 million copies. Suddenly, debates about curriculum, about which authors, which histories, which voices belong in the canon become front-page news. Like, you know, in the big newspapers, big media. Through these decades, a pattern forms. Every generation reimagines the university as a battlefield of values. In the 1990s, so post-Cold War, the impulse becomes organized. The American Council of Trustees and Alumni, or ACTA, founded with the help of Lynn Cheney, urges boards and alumni to restore intellectual balance. Their message, universities have lost their way. Trustees must step in, right? So very, very clear strategy. And this is a real shift, right? Alan Bloom would never have set up an organization, would never have been thinking about the university as an institution and as a site in which to create transformation. He really wanted to persuade people through the force of his argument. This is something very, very different. This is strategic organization. And with a very clear approach, trustees are the key to changing public higher education. So the goal is to subdue faculty, so the professors, and to restrict shared governance, and to urge trustees to really use the power that they have to overrule presidents of universities and faculty governing bodies when conflicts arise. The breakout moment for ACTA came after September 11th, 2001, when they published a report. It was called Defending Civilization: How Our Universities Are Failing America and What Can Be Done About It. And in that report, they had a list of university professors who had, according to them, made unpatriotic statements and denouncing the scholars who they thought for their anti-Americanism. Now, it could take very little to get you on the list. So Todd Gitlin, very well-known scholar, well-known also leftist, right, who at the same time is still attached to the American flag and draped it on his apartment and was denouncing anti-Americanism abroad, discovers through a New York Times article that he's on the list. And the thing that got him onto the list was that he described the mood on his campus, that there's a lot of skepticism about the administration's policy of going to war. Now, something that might be useful to know, by the way, is Lynn Cheney. She's the wife of Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney, he's passed away very, very recently. He was the vice president of George W. Bush, and he's considered by many to be the most powerful vice president that the United States has had. Very, very influential, including in the decision to invade Iraq and to use waterboarding to torture people in order to get information that would lead to figuring out what had happened on 9/11 and to engaging in the war on terror through those kinds of means. So she was not just a smart strategist, but she was also tied into the highest levels of power in Washington. Other scholars went further, right, than Gitlin did, comparing the report's list of names to the McCarthy era. It has a little of the whiff of McCarthyism, said Hugh Gusterson, a professor at MIT, who is on the list for a comment he made at a campus peace rally. Imagine the real suffering and grief of people in other countries, right? So this was enough to get you on this blacklist. And the report quotes him as saying, the best way to begin a war on terrorism might be to look in the mirror. Later on, this is some years later, 2 decades later, right, they moved not just to influence the trustees at universities, but in fact to transform the entire university system, right? So here, this is from 2023, they're making an argument. So during, not yet, this is before Trump is elected for the second time, but making an argument about that Congress needs to completely eradicate the existing higher education accreditation model and process and have a completely different kind of system. Around the same time, the writer and activist David Horowitz launched his campaign for an academic, quote, academic Bill of Rights. On the surface, it sounds protective. Who could oppose balance and fairness? But the effect is to invite legislatures to monitor courses and professors for ideological bias. The American Association of University Professors warns that such laws would politicize classrooms and chill discussion. And the thing that I want to show you is that for Horowitz, his own understanding of what he was doing was really fighting for academic freedom. And so you have, in fact, a real debate going on about what does academic freedom entail, where you have two sides that have them, each of them have a sense of having their own academic freedom be curtailed, be damaged, be not respected, and that the activities in which they are engaged is to protect that academic freedom. So that's a very important element of this activism from conservatives who are making arguments for these very drastic kinds of interventions in universities and are tracking professors, are tracking classrooms, is that the arguments that they're making, however, is that they're doing all of this on behalf of academic freedom. By the early 2000s, the campaign has moved from rhetoric to model legislation. Conservative think tanks, including the American Legislative Exchange Council, begin drafting bills with titles like Campus Free Speech Act. Dozens of state legislatures adopt versions. They remove free speech zones, impose disciplinary rules on protest, and require universities to prove that they treat all views equally. At this point, the struggle is no longer mainly cultural, it's institutional. Then come the new media entrepreneurs. In 2016, Charlie Kirk, a 22-year-old activist, creates Turning Point USA and its Professor Watch List. So here's the watch list emblem, right? And it's a website that names academics accused of, quote, left-wing bias. It publishes photographs, course titles, and quotes, and faculty unions warn that the list fuels harassment and threats. And there's quite a few professors who end up on that list who end up feeling very, very unsafe because of the ways in which they're starting to get harassed. Kirk calls it accountability. Christopher Rufo, a documentary maker turned strategist, adds another layer. In 2021, he wrote his strategy, it was entitled Lay Siege to the Institutions, Capture the Bureaucracy. His focus is education policy, K through 12, then higher ed, working closely with governors, such as Ron DeSantis in Florida. He helps engineer the overhaul of the new College of Florida. So what does he do? Like ACTA had talked about, the trustees are replaced. This was a well-known liberal arts and progressive university. He and DeSantis, the governor, are a quite visible government in the United States, Republican, who had aspirations of a presidential run, but then sort of failed spectacularly once he went national. Rufo and DeSantis engineer the replacement of the trustees, the removal of diversity programs, the rewriting of curricula. The method is simple. Change the board and the institution will follow. Right? So what is the first thing, once the new trustees meet, the first thing that they do is that they oust the president of the college. And one of the very important points, right, and you can sort of read it here in the little letters, right, it says DeSantis is not simply inveighing against progressive control of institutions, so he's not simply arguing against that progressive control, he's using his power as the governor of Florida to remake them. So here we already have an early example, this is 2023, again during the Biden administration, of this remaking of universities in the images that these conservatives would like them to be. Last but not least, under the banner of Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation has drafted a 900-page plan for the next Republican administration, including proposals to curb the Department of Education, redirect funding, research, impose new oversight on universities, eliminate diversity, equity, and inclusion mandates, and promote Western values as academic standards, and investigate and punish dissenting campuses, right? So certain elements of what we're seeing that Trump has been doing are also to be found in this notorious Project 2025. The ambition is clear, to reshape education at the level of structure, not just speech. Some of the politicians connected to this movement have become household names. Vice President J.D. Vance likes to quote Nixon, "The professors are the enemy." He studied at Yale Law School, but presents the academy as a hostile elite, a world detached from the working class he claims to represent. That phrase captures the new mood, not resentment of a single policy, but mistrust of an entire knowledge class. When you put all these pieces together, Buckley's books, Acta's trustee network, Horowitz's legislation, Kirk's watch list, Rufo's institutional capture, and Heritage's policy blueprints, you see a continuum strategy. 1. Frame the university as decadent or biased. 2. Mobilize donors, alumni, and lawmakers. 3. Translate moral outrage into new rules, new boards, and new budgets. Donald Trump did not invent this playbook. He inherited it. What makes his administration distinctive is the speed and scale with which it acted, using executive orders and funding suspensions to turn a cultural narrative into government policy. For Americans, for his constituents, this campaign feels like a defense of fairness and national values. For progressives, it is a devastating and brutal attack. The result is that education becomes a primary arena in which the battle over democracy itself is fought. In the United States, that battle often plays out as a conflict between individuals and their institutions, professors against boards, university boards, researchers against administrators, university presidents against politicians. The struggle over academic freedom is not only what may be taught, but also about who the university ultimately serves: the public, the donor, or the scholar's own conscience. The origins of that idea go back to 1915, when a group of American professors, led by someone called Arthur Lovejoy, a philosopher dismissed from Stanford University, drafted the first Declaration of Principles on academic freedom and academic tenure. So this was long before you really had sort of this kind of organization of, formal organization of academic freedom in this fashion in Europe. And the context was that this was a time of professionalization. You had doctors were organizing as professionals. You had lawyers who were organizing as professionals. And now within the universities in the United States, you had scholars starting to organize as professionals. And the reason what had gotten all of this going was that Lovejoy was fired from Stanford University after he criticized the wealthy Mrs. Jane Stanford, who had insisted that professors should teach moral uplift rather than Darwinian evolution. His case symbolized a growing tension between the ideals of independent inquiry and the control of universities by trustees, churches, and industrial magnates, right? I think Jane Stanford's husband, Mr. Stanford, was a very, very wealthy railroad developer. So you have a very different kind of development of academic freedom in the United States. Because many of the universities in which it starts developing, these are private universities, and so rather than having the academic freedom as you have it in continental Europe, which very often is the freedom of universities and the protection of universities relative to the state, in the United States, a very important element of academic freedom is the freedom of the individual academic, and in particular, the freedom of the individual academic to speak out. And to speak out not only as a scientist, but also as a citizen. Because at this time, at the beginning of the 20th century, you also started having problems when you had social scientists who, in studying social science, started to develop very serious criticisms of, for example, capitalism, of the kind of urban development that was taking place, labor exploitation. And their research clarified where the sources of that exploitation came from, and that it did not come from the backwardness or the lack of intelligence of those who were exploited, but in fact from systems that were to the benefit of the rich and to the benefit of those who were exploiting. When they started to speak out to that, a number of universities started to fire them. And so that's very important, and I don't have it quite worked into the rest of my talk, but I have it in there because I think it's very relevant to our discussions about academic freedom relative to the protests that have been taking place at universities over the last year. In the United States, speech by individual scholars, right, is protected speech. Speech by students is protected speech, and it falls under what's called extramural, so outside the walls of the university. Speech. And you don't have that same kind of protection here in Europe. The 1915 declaration, which later gave birth to the American Association of University Professors, turned that tension, right, between independent inquiry and the control of universities by trustees, churches, and industrial magnates, the Elon Musks of that day, into a professional principle. Professors should have freedom of research and of speech both inside and outside the classroom, and their employment should be protected by tenure so that ideas could not be punished or silenced. In this way, academic freedom in the US became a right attached to the individual scholar. It was a moral and a professional covenant between the scholar and the public, guaranteed ideally by the university, but often defended against it. Over time, court cases constitutionalized this principle, making it part of the fabric of American democracy. Here in Europe, the history is different. Here, because universities grew as public institutions under the protection and supervision of the state, academic freedom was seen not as the liberty of the individual professor, but as the autonomy of the university as a collective, the freedom of a scholarly community to govern itself and to set its own research agenda within the framework of public responsibility. Right? And that notion of public responsibility, the public responsibility of the university, and also the public responsibility of the individual scholar, right, is something that is a kind of language and a conceptualization of academic freedom that is quite different from what you find in the United States. The KNAW's, the KNAW's, the Dutch Royal Society of Science 2021 report on academic freedom describes this clearly. In the Netherlands, academic freedom rests on professional integrity, collegial oversight, and the public trust that universities will act responsibly. It is embedded in procedures, not in heroics. And those heroics in the US would include something like speaking truth to power. Professors are expected to be independent within the system, not against the system. That makes the Dutch model both stronger and more vulnerable. Stronger because it is protected by the state's constitutional commitment to the independence of scholarship, but also more vulnerable because the threats here are systemic rather than personal. They come not from political purges or dismissals, but from the slow tightening of funding priorities, the bureaucratization of research ethics, and the growing tendency to judge academic work by reputation, image, and utility. In the Netherlands, academic freedom is constrained less by ideology than by policy and pragmatism, by the pressure to align with ministerial missions, European research frameworks, or public sentiment, all of which leaves less and less room for simply curiosity. So while American professors may fear losing their jobs for what they say, Dutch scholars fear losing the conditions that make independent thinking possible, and those are time, trust, and institutional courage. Both models are under strain, but in profoundly different ways. In the Netherlands, that strain has become visible this past year on our own campuses. The pro-Palestinian protests at Dutch universities, Amsterdam, Utrecht, elsewhere, were not only about Gaza. They were also about the moral position of the university itself, how it defines neutrality, and whose suffering it chooses to acknowledge. Some rectors called for safety and order. Others appealed to dialogue. Yet the underlying issue was the same one we saw at Columbia. When political conflict enters the university, how do institutions balance moral responsibility and procedural restraint? The protests revealed a deep uncertainty about what academic freedom actually means in a public system like ours here in the Netherlands. Does it protect only research and teaching, or also the scholar's public conscience, right? And this was the argument, for example, of many of the students up in Utrecht, where I was at, who say, you're teaching us about international law, you're teaching us about human rights. If you are teaching us about it, and if you believe in it, why then are you not speaking out on behalf of these, right? And so that question of what does this entail, right? How do you balance moral responsibility against your other commitments? When students and staff occupy buildings to protest a war or a genocide, are they undermining the university's integrity, or are they enacting it? Do they give shape to it? What we saw was not American polarization transplanted to Dutch soil, but a mirror held up to our own structure of trust. Here, the threats to academic freedom rarely take the form of censorship or police orders, at least not with the same intensity as the US, though there has been censorship. They're quieter, the gradual narrowing of what counts as relevant, the managerial language that replaces judgment with metrics, the fear among younger scholars that certain topics, from decolonization to Palestine, are too charged to pursue openly. These are not spectacular erosions, but erosions by sedimentation, layer upon layer of compliance and caution, each one reasonable in itself, until the ground of freedom feels hard and thin beneath our feet. In the end, whether New York or Maastricht, the question is the same. What kind of university do we want to be when the world around us is divided? To defend academic freedom is not only to protect speech or science. It is to cultivate the moral and institutional courage to listen to what unsettles us, to bear conflict without rushing to contain it, and to remain publicly accountable for the ways knowledge is made and is used. The erosion of academic freedom is real, but so is our capacity to renew it. Each generation must refound that covenant between truth and trust, between conscience and community. And that, I think, is the work before us now. Thank you.